Well, hello and welcome. My name is Bill Nussey. I am the author of Freeing Energy, a book about the transformational change in how we generate and consume electricity around the world. I am truly honored to be here today and to share what I learned from the book, including a bit of my own personal story, to all of you in Japan for the very first time. I have to thank my collaborator, Tetsu, who helped make this event possible and helped me translate with many of his colleagues the book into Japanese, which will be available either by the time you see this or shortly afterwards. But I'm very excited to share how the book came together and why I wrote it. So let me start at the beginning. Back in 2014, I had just sold my company called Silverpop to IBM, and we were doing interviews with the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times and other business media talking about how Silverpop was going to become a marketing cloud for IBM. It was an amazing day, and I decided to step away and sit by myself for a moment to take it all in so I could remember it. Well, as I sat there and thought about what this meant for my career and my life, I was overcome with a feeling that all these people I had met through my life that had given so much of their time and energy, many of them did not have the career and the network and the contacts and the financial comfort that I did. And how could I do anything less than they were doing? So I set off on a quest to find something to spend the rest of my life doing that mattered, that could make a real difference. I wanted to accomplish three things. I wanted to help the planet and the environment. I wanted to help the millions or hundreds of millions of people whose lives are not all they could be and are disadvantaged for reasons of wealth or health or where they live. But I also am a capitalist, and I wanted to pursue something that could make a big financial impact. And I came across clean energy, and I was extremely excited about it. Clean energy will reverse the damage that our energy systems have been making on the planet. It will improve the lives of the 770 million people that have no electricity at all today, and another billion to 1.5 billion where electricity is sporadic, unavailable, or unaffordable. And the third box was checked. The transition to clean energy will be the biggest business opportunity in history. When I ask people what they think the largest infrastructure projects in the United States are, they often say, correctly, that it was the development of the US highway system over 30 years for about $550 billion. A lot of people are surprised to learn that over the last 25 years, a total of $1 trillion in venture capital money has been invested in companies in early internet and mobile and things like that. But all of those numbers are dwarfed by what's coming. The smallest estimate of the money that will be invested to facilitate the transition to clean energy is $17 trillion in the next 25 years. This is 10, 20 times more money than humans have ever put into anything we have accomplished as a species. This is incredibly exciting. And if the governments of the world, with the United States and China and others, start to aggressively work to slow climate change and reverse it, the $17 trillion could be as much as twice as large. This is the largest opportunity for business people in the history of the world. So how do I get into clean energy? What role could I play? What were the opportunities? So I spent 5 years traveling around to 6 countries, interviewed 320 people, and gathered up hundreds of spreadsheets and documents and articles, all of which are notated in my book. I traveled to China to sit with the leaders and founders of the largest solar companies in the world. I traveled to Africa, East Africa, and sat with people who had never had electricity in their lives or people that had just recently got it. and learned the tremendous benefits that electrification provided for them in their lives. I went to Europe to see solar manufacturing and science and cutting-edge technology. This is a picture from one of the most automated solar cell and module manufacturer facilities in the world. I even got to climb to the top of a wind turbine. I went to visit one of the startups that is creating fusion energy, and there's several of these right now. Some of them are very exciting. I went to the US government's Department of Energy facilities. This is a picture from the National Renewable Energy Labs out in Colorado in the US, where I sat down with leaders and scientists to talk about new technologies for solar. And my book starts with the story of when I went down to Puerto Rico and met with people in several small towns that had been hit hard by Hurricane Maria, many of whom had been without electricity for 9 months. And the reason I went to these towns is that they had recently built schools with microgrids that were able to operate independently of the failing Puerto Rico grid and be able to run their classes and also take care of their communities when the power grid was unavailable. So what did I learn? Well, it wasn't good news. The energy systems that we have today are very outdated and broken. Our efforts to upgrade these systems will take decades, which is far too long to address the urgent need to reverse climate change. I learned some other really terrifying details. I didn't realize just how fragile the grid is. Here in the US, we see increasing numbers of outages, like in Texas, where a cold snap caused the power grid to go down for days, killing hundreds of people. Obviously, Puerto Rico a few years earlier. California has their grid go down regularly, and oftentimes because the utility is actually forcing it to turn off for safety reasons. Cyber attacks, the grid issues and the harm done by the Fukushima nuclear power plant meltdown, the list goes on and on. And yet, if you listen to the world's leaders, including the President of the United States, the answer is that we need to build enormous, large-scale power systems, giant power plants, wind, solar, maybe some natural gas and nuclear. The problem is that transmission lines take years and years and years to build. In the US right now, the average time for a transmission line to be approved and built is 4 years from when it starts. And it takes many years just to create a proposal. 75% of the transmission projects drop out because they run out of time and money. And the largest grid operator in the United States just recently requested permission to delay all transmission projects for 2 years, meaning that the newest transmission project in their region wouldn't go online until 2027. So this is very difficult to reconcile with the urgent need to address climate change now. But nobody seems to be pointing this out. No one seems to realize that all the methods to rapidly address climate change will take a decade, and none more so than nuclear. The fastest and newest plant to be built in the United States is just a pilot test project by a small modular reactor company called NuScale. And this pilot isn't anticipated to go live until 2029. And it would be another decade if everything went incredibly well for that project to be multiplied into tens and hundreds of gigawatts of energy which are needed. And even if everything works, even the advocates of nuclear agree that nuclear will be 2 to 3 times, maybe 3 or 4 times more expensive than solar. But the part that I found most agonizing and difficult was the fact that the electricity industry has atrophied. It has stagnated. Innovation has completely stopped. And I illustrate this with a story in my book. I imagine that I have a time machine, and I go back in time and I find the Wright brothers, the inventor of powered flight. And I say to them, come into 2022 and let me show you what the airplane has become. I would take them on a trip on a 747 or an F-15 fighter jet and say, look what your invention has created. I would go back to Charles Babbage and say, come and look what computers are today. I would go to Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and I would say, look at what your invention has become 100 years later. This one single device can access the sum total of all human knowledge with just fingertip presses. You can reach any one of billions of human beings with simply typing in 10 numbers. This simple invention of yours has changed the world. But yet, if I went back and talked to Thomas Edison or Nikola Tesla and brought them forward 100 years, they would look around at a substation or a coal plant and they would say, wait a minute, this is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. How could you have all these other technologies that have dramatically progressed and innovated to mind-boggling levels, and yet the power industry has remained almost identical for 100 years? And I found this extremely distressing. And how can this be? How can this one industry have ground to a halt in terms of innovation? Well, we actually have the technology today to change the way that power is generated around the world. But the problem isn't the technology, it's the business model. Everywhere in the world, including and starting with the US, the electricity industry is run by a regulated monopoly or a state-run monopoly that was created as a business model in the early 1900s, and it remains nearly unchanged. In most places in the world, there's absolutely no competition for better, more innovative ways to create electricity. In the US, the profits of the electricity companies are guaranteed. In the US, people find this surprising, but in my book, I cite many sources to say that of all the industries in the United States, including used car dealerships and restaurants, the electricity industry spends less money on research and development than any other industry, less than 0.1% of their revenue. And in striking contrast, depending on whose numbers you look at, the electricity industry is the largest spender of lobbying money, lobbying regulators and legislators and elected officials. They're either the first or fourth largest spender of lobbying money in the United States across all industries. And as an engineer, I just struggle to realize that the brilliant invention that Thomas Edison and later Nikola Tesla with AC power, 60 hertz, 110 volts, remains identical to what he created 100 years ago, or actually 120, 140 years ago. So it's easy to get frustrated. And when I was doing my research on the book, I became very sad because I was concerned that this industry would never live up to its potential. It would never embrace innovation. It would never move into the 21st century like so many other industries have. But with more research, I found that there is a better path. It's one of the biggest trends in the world that's absolutely going to happen, and almost nobody sees it coming. In my very early research, I put together some ideas, and I had the privilege of sharing them on the TED stage, and you can go watch that. Although I would tell you that the ideas have come a very long way since that TED Talk, and the opportunities are so much larger than I realized when I did that speech 3 or 4 years ago. The next $1 trillion technology disruption is going to be what I call local energy, community solar, rooftop solar, building integrated photovoltaics, microgrids, and small-scale batteries. Any system where the generation of electricity and the storage of electricity is taking place in the same home or the same campus or the same community where that same electricity is being consumed. For most people, this is just one more small piece of the electricity puzzle. But what I have discovered is this is an entirely new industry with entirely new business opportunities, entirely new competitive landscapes, requiring and benefiting from new regulations. And this is the opportunity to move electricity more quickly into the future, to bring innovation to an industry that has stagnated, and to create business opportunities that will attract billions, hundreds of billions of dollars for investors and entrepreneurs. So just to give you a quick comparison between the grid that was invented by Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse and regulated by Samuel Insull, in comparing that to where the world is going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. The old grid, what I call in the book the big grid, was controlled by giant corporations. In the future, many of the parts of the grid are going to be controlled by families and communities and individuals and campuses. The old grid, the 20th century grid, the electricity prices have been steadily rising, and in most places in the world, those prices are expected to continue rising. In the new world of local energy, families will see lower prices, and those prices will be locked in for years and years, because once the solar panel is built, you simply pay it off, and it generates electricity for no money at all. And when the financing is completely paid off, all the electricity is actually free. The 20th century grid is defined by fuels, coal, gas, uranium. In the 21st century grid, local energy is defined by technologies, solar and batteries. The old grid, when you're building giant wind farms and solar farms, doesn't employ many people. But when you build small-scale systems, in the US, rooftop solar and community solar and commercial solar create 10 times more jobs than the large-scale projects. And in the United States, jobs are one of the most important goals, and yet nobody in the government is talking about just how many jobs can be created with this kind of small-scale local energy. And one of the reasons we're not doing anything in the United States and most of the world is that in order to make these large-scale systems work, we have to pass massive, complex, contentious changes in policy. And in the United States, nothing's getting done. Whereas the small-scale systems are regulated locally at the city and county and state level, and they can move much more quickly and require only minor changes in regulation. And in fact, they are already moving very aggressively with the regulations as they exist today. Local energy is not waiting on regulations. Across the United States, outages are happening more frequently. Everybody agrees that small-scale local energy systems that include batteries are the best way to deal with outages at the grid level, but yet there's no large focus on this. There's no national focus and no recognition that this is actually a complete solution that can be put in place. But most concerning for those of us that are watching climate change seem to get worse and worse every year is that every solution being discussed, transmission, nuclear, large-scale wind and solar farms, take 5, 6, 10 years to develop its scale. It takes 4, 5, 6 years to put up a new solar project, a large-scale solar project today. But yet a rooftop solar can be put up in a matter of days. And if you include permitting and financing, it can be done in a matter of weeks. And again, no one's recognizing the speed with which we can build local energy, yet it's the fastest solution available to us. This is why I wrote the book. This is why I'm so excited to share the book with all of you in Japan, because if you're listening to this, you probably realize this opportunity exists. You're frustrated by the lack of knowledge and support, and I hope that my book will lend additional voice and credibility to those of us that want to educate our leaders and our legislators and our neighbors that there's a much better path available today that we can all take individual action on and move forward. But when I give this speech, people ask me, or they challenge me. You know, in the US and around the world, the utilities are some of the most politically powerful companies, and they do not want local energy. Most of them do not want local energy to take off because it will reduce their revenues and their profits over time, and it will, more importantly, reduce their market power, since most of them are monopolies and face no competition. So how can we possibly create systems that can compete with regulated monopolies and giant billion-dollar corporations? Well, before I give you that answer, let me briefly explain a concept that I introduced in the book called the 5 Orders of Innovation. And this comes from my experience of being a professional venture capitalist, for running strategy at IBM worldwide, and having started and grown multiple companies. The first order of innovation, it's the bottom of the stack, is the creation of components. This would be small discrete pieces. In the energy business, this would be solar cells and panels or batteries. But if if you think about it from the computer industry, which I'm very familiar with, having been in it for decades, you could think of these components as Intel who makes the microprocessors. The second order is integrations, where you take existing components and you put them together into a new and better product. As I explained throughout my book, this is one of the biggest areas of innovation that most people overlook. An example of that in the US is Dell, who takes existing components and puts them together to create computers that ended up being so competitive that Dell became a giant company, even though they were competing with established companies like IBM and others that were creating their own computers. One of my favorite stories about the power of integrations is Tesla. When they launched their Model S in 2012, they didn't have brand new battery chemistries or fantastic new magnets for their motors that no one else had. They actually went and bought all the parts for the Tesla Model S from the existing marketplace. They put them together in incredibly innovative ways and created what Car and Driver magazine calls the greatest car ever created in the history of cars. And every single part that Tesla purchased was available to Mercedes and Honda and Toyota and General Motors and Ford. Yet it was a crazy outside company that put those pieces together in a unique way that no one had ever thought of before. They used laptop batteries and people laughed at them for doing that. And yet, as we all know today, Tesla has created some of the greatest cars ever, and more importantly, has caused the entire world to realize that electric vehicles are here, that they're real, and they're a better option for our future. The third order is services. An example of this in the software computer world is Google, where you take first and second order businesses and you transform them into a service so that people pay for it or use it in small bits and they don't have to invest in the capital to create factories or to buy assets. The best example of the services for the energy industry is the grid. You don't have to buy a coal plant yourself. You don't even have to buy solar panels on your roof yourself. Someone will finance it for you, and then you can buy it by the kilowatt hour. That's a great example of the third order business. The next two orders are where it gets really exciting. And this is where venture capitalists are streaming to raising billions of dollars and then putting them into startups all over the world. In the software world, we call them platforms. This is a place where people and businesses come to transact with each other. One of the best examples of a platform is Apple's App Store, where third-party companies sell their apps and Apple gets a commission for those sales. Apple makes a fortune on this, but because people want to be on their platform, they pay that fee. One of my favorite examples in software is a company called Salesforce.com, who has a platform for managing sales, but they have turned it into a platform for the entire way of running a business. And entire publicly traded companies are built on top of software, on top of Salesforce.com software. And every time someone uses one of those products, Salesforce.com makes a little bit of money. This is an incredibly exciting place to be. And in my book, I have dozens of examples of platforms that are emerging for local energy. One of my favorite examples I refer to is choreographing electrons. Managing like a traffic cop, the stopping and starting and switching of electrons from today's grid, where it's like broadcast television or radio, where all the electrons flow from the center and they just go outwards to homes and businesses, to the new world where electrons are flowing in two ways. People are buying and trading electricity with each other, and the companies and the technologies that manage that trading are going to be incredibly successful. But nothing excites venture capitalists more than a fifth order. And this is a disruption. And a disruption is where a first, second, third, fourth order business that's existing in a single industry moves into a brand new industry that didn't see it coming and completely changes that industry. So if you think about Uber or Lyft or any of the ride-sharing companies, you can think of them really as just little applications that are running on an iPhone or an Android phone. But to the taxi industry, they changed everything and almost destroyed the taxi industry. And that dichotomy, that difference where it could be just something, a small application running on a platform in an existing software industry, but it can simultaneously disrupt and recreate and reinvent an entirely new industry around ride sharing, and partial ownership of vehicles. And we're going to see in the energy industry tremendous fifth order disruptions. A good example is electric vehicles are a fifth order disruption on the oil and petroleum and gasoline companies. There's many other examples in my book. So let me explain to you how this 5 orders of innovation will allow local energy to become so successful it will be unstoppable and it will disrupt the existing monopoly electric utility industries. First of all, the cost of components is decreasing very rapidly. The price of solar since 1970s has dropped 400 times. Incredible. But it's just getting started. If you compare the price of solar to any other type of energy generation, it's on its way to being the least expensive way to generate electricity ever created. And even though there's reason to believe that nuclear will be somewhat cheaper, even at its cheapest, it'll be 3 or 4 times more expensive than solar. And batteries are declining in cost. In the last 10 years alone, batteries have declined almost 90% in cost. And as the capacity of manufacturing goes up, a concept I call economies of volume in the book, manufacturing at scale. There's many different terms to describe it, but the more factories we make, the more units we produce, and the cheaper each unit gets. And in the book, I have several projections for the scale of upcoming battery factories, and it is enormous. And there's so much innovation in new battery chemistries that I get into in the book that it's inevitable that the price of batteries will become so inexpensive that it will be cost effective to pair them with solar and create local energy solutions that are significantly cheaper than the grid. And the cost of integrations is getting cheaper quickly as well. Now let's talk about local scale solar. The US is one of the most expensive places to build rooftop solar in the world, but Japan isn't much cheaper. This is some information from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. And they mapped out the price per watt of putting solar on a roof in multiple countries. And as you can see, Japan in US dollars is $2.20. It's quite a bit more expensive in the US at $3.80. But in, for example, Australia, it's only half the price of Japan at $1.20 in US. Now, what's really interesting is that if you compare the US to Australia, this assumes that they're using the exact same parts. They're using the same solar panels like Qcell or Jinko. They're using the same inverters like SolarEdge or Enphase. And they're paying people to climb on the roof to install these things. So how is it that you could have Australian installation be twice as expensive or half the price of Japan and a third the price of the United States? What's creating this difference? It's all about something called soft costs. And in the US, we call this bureaucracy or red tape. It's unnecessary and slow regulations and policies and approvals that add so much to the cost. In fact, in most residential installations in the US, the solar panels are only 10 to 15% of the entire cost. All the rest of it is additional hardware and labor, and the largest piece is soft costs, as you can see here in this graph. It's about half the costs, and this is sourced from a different place, so the $2.71 here is equivalent to the $3.80 that IRENA used for the United States. But the idea is the same. And as you can see, soft costs are very high in small-scale solar because of all the local regulations. And Australia has made national laws that make this much easier and much more streamlined. And fortunately, the US is finally making some big moves to reduce the soft costs. In an amazing public-private partnership where governments and commercial companies have come together, they've created a free solution called Solar App Plus. This is available to any government in the United States, and if we are trying to get it connected into people in Japan through Tetsu and others so that Japanese towns and cities and villages can use this too. And the goal is to take processes that require in-person visits, that require physical paperwork, and make it all streamlined inside of an app. Pre-approving components and certain designs so that it doesn't have to be reviewed by engineers at the local county or village government. This is very exciting. And if Japan can do what the US is doing, and we can all do what Australia is doing, we are going to see the price of local energy just continue to plummet, continue to decrease, and it will be so much cheaper than any other way to generate electricity. And it all comes together in the third order, the services that are decreasing in price. This is for the US, and it shows just how far the price of middle scale electricity, like maybe on a building, has come down. In 2012, it was 24 cents US, and in 2018 to 2020, it became the same price as buying electricity from the grid. And by the middle of this decade, it will be half the price of buying electricity from the grid. And in a few decades, it will be a quarter the price of buying electricity from the grid. And I expect every other country to have the same experience, so that individuals and businesses and families will look at their costs and they'll realize that they can save so much money by generating their own electricity from rooftop solar and adding batteries, that they'll simply buy less and less from the grid. This is unstoppable. This means that local energy becomes irresistible. Today, the utilities are having some success in the United States fighting local energy by adding fees and making it difficult, capping the amount of connections and things like that. But as people realize in democracies that they can save a tremendous amount of money, help the environment, create resilience for their families and homes, at some point, all the laws will change, as they should, to support individuals and communities and allow them to save money, to create resilience for their families. And local energy will absolutely be an unstoppable, irresistible force. It's already happening today. And I describe this as a four-phase change. When solar was first commercial, it was expensive, and the people who installed solar 10 or 20 years ago were largely motivated to help the environment. US and Japanese and other governments decided to create economic incentives like tax incentives or grants to help accelerate solar adoption. And currently, solar is less expensive thanks to policies and subsidies and tax incentives in some places. Other places, it's already cheaper regardless of subsidies. But solar will continue to go down until it's the lowest cost source of electricity for anybody, anywhere. But it will keep going down past that, and more solar will get installed. There are credible research projects in the US that say that there is enough rooftop and parking lots available in the US to power the entire country. Not just the homes and the buildings, but to power industry, to power commercial applications. And I think in Japan, an incredibly exciting opportunity is agrovoltaics, where solar is mixed in with farmland. And there are many crops, as I discuss in my book, that actually will grow better when they're around solar panels because of the shading. And solar panels reduce the evaporation of moisture from the soil. So growing plants and solar actually is better than either one of them on the land by itself. The same goes for grazing animals. It is easy to have sheep and cows grazing on the same land where solar panels exist. In fact, they reduce one of the most expensive maintenance costs of solar, which is keeping the grasses shorter so they don't block the solar panels. I believe that Japan will lead the world in agrovoltaics because of the country's deep respect for its land and its natural heritage from its forests and its love of nature. So how do we take all this and turn it into the last goal I had for myself and for the industry? How do we make all these things create a huge financial impact? Well, in my book, I cover 50 emerging market segments, each of which is a multi-billion-dollar US dollar opportunity. Some examples include building integrated photovoltaics, making driveways and sidewalks and carports all solar powered, recycling solar, streamlining soft cost reductions, new battery and solar technologies built specifically for homes and buildings. Almost all the products today are built for utility scale, and they're shrunk down but never optimized for small scales. Microgrids are going to begin to proliferate. The software needed for this is a tremendous opportunity. Same thing for monitoring and controlling these systems. Japan is one of the early places, Europe, Australia, where people are able to pioneer trading electricity with each other. This is illegal. It's against the law in the United States today, but will eventually become universally legal everywhere in the world because it is such a good solution. And I could go on, and these are just an example, but I want to finish up today with one brief example of one of my favorite and most exciting disruptions and fourth order and fifth order models. That's electric vehicles, V2G, V2H, which means vehicle to grid and vehicle to home. Up until recently, the idea of using a vehicle like a car or a truck and sending its battery power back to the grid or back to the home was a very small idea. Most people were not aware of it. But when Ford introduced their new truck, their electric truck, the Ford 150 Lightning, basically an electric version of the most popular vehicle sold in the United States. And Ford advertised, not only did this have tremendous range and power, but it could be plugged in to your home and provide backup power in the event that your home grid went offline. And for people in California and Texas who have recently dealt with outages, this is a very appealing feature. And every other company selling electric vehicles will be forced to copy this. The Nissan Leaf has always had this ability. Tesla, for reasons, decided not to offer this. I interviewed one of their executives and he explained it to me that because battery cycles are still very limited, perhaps a few thousand cycles, they didn't want customers disappointed when they powered their house and saw their car batteries wear out too soon. But the cycle count on batteries is getting better and better every year. And so it will soon not cause any reduction in the car's value to use it to power your home, not just during outages, but all the time. EVs will become an absolutely integral part of the grid, and utilities are very excited about it. In the United States, the per capita consumption of electricity has actually started shrinking over the last few years, primarily because of the efficiency of LED bulbs and efficient appliances like air conditioning and refrigerators. So electric vehicle charging is the first growth that the electricity industry has had an opportunity to see in many years. And many utilities, including the one I work with called Georgia Power, gives me a special rate to motivate me to charge my car overnight when their grid is not congested and it isn't at peak load. And they charge me much lower electricity rates to charge my car at night. And I do. I only charge my car at night unless I'm going to go for a very long trip immediately. But it gets more exciting because of the Ford 150 and other new cars coming out where they can actually take that power and send it back to the grid. Utilities are very excited about that because it means grid owners have to spend less on batteries themselves. There's many words for this, like virtual power plant, aggregation, but all of it means that these individual cars and trucks can be managed as a unit and help the grid be managed better. But I'm excited about it because the individual cars can also power the house. So it's not just to help the grid, It actually helps the house. So I would have to buy fewer residential batteries because my car is helping me store electricity from bright sunny days to where I can discharge the stored electricity overnight to power my home at night. And this is really exciting because in the United States, it is illegal for anyone other than a utility to sell a kilowatt hour. But that has recently changed, and 30 states have allowed electric vehicle charging to be priced by the kilowatt hour. This is the first time in 100 years that someone besides a utility has been able to sell a kilowatt hour. And this is going to become a new way, a new door through which innovation and the sale of competitive electricity can work. There's also going to be new competitors. Royal Dutch Shell, one of the largest oil companies in the world, has said that it plans to become the largest electricity company in the world. So electric utilities are facing disruptions, not just from entrepreneurs like me, but also traditional oil companies who are typically 10 times larger and vastly more assets and capital. The electric utility business is in for a great deal of change in the next 10 years. And all of these new business models, which I talk about in the book, are some of the most exciting. Vehicle to home, something I call mobile battery to home, where the delivery vehicles like ordering from Amazon or grocery deliveries, they have large batteries and they can briefly plug into your house and charge your house battery in case it's been rainy and your solar panels haven't been able to fully charge your battery. This will be legal, it will be technically straightforward, and it's going to create hundreds of billions of dollars worth of business opportunities. So I hope that you are as excited as I am about the impact, the environmental impact and potential, the economic and entrepreneurial opportunities of local energy, and the technologies that are driving this. And I want to end with a quote from one of the most respected people that I interviewed during my book research. It's a man named Jim Rogers, who has since passed away, but at the time he was the CEO of Duke Energy, which is the largest electric utility in the United States. And he believed and loved the history of the industry. He was famous for being one of the first utility executives to acknowledge that renewable energy was the future. And he told me at dinner, he said, it's time for the power industry to become a technology business again. We are now in the age of renewables that are powered by technologies and not fuels. Small-scale energy is going to transform and disrupt everything we've taken for granted in the electricity industry for a century. And I'm very excited to bring some of these ideas to all of you today in this call and to any of you that read the book. Japan is a tremendous innovator, whether it's consumer electronics or automobiles and fantastic quality. The inventions and visions of Japan have transformed the world, and I hope through agrivoltaics and rooftop solar that Japan will do the same to inspire and drive the world in local renewable energy. Thank you very much for having me today.